statistically, we know that 25% of people who start calorie counting will go on to develop an eating disorder. 35% will spend the rest of their life with some unhealthy relationship with food.
So having personally suffered with anorexia, what was the turning point that led to your recovery?
So for me, the turning point has to be when I was in treatment. So at this point, I'd lived with anorexia for about 4 years, kind of kept it secret from everyone around me. Spent 6 months as an outpatient at the Children's Adolescent Mental Health Services, and then eventually was admitted to a mental health hospital. And for the first 3 days, I was in this constant state of denial, not really sure that anything was the matter with me. I was so anxious all the time, was really angry a lot of the time. But on the Friday night, one of the nurses came in to see me, and she brought with her these massive pieces of paper. And she marked on one of the pieces of paper where my head was and where my feet were. And then she got me to draw how I imagined myself. So I kind of knelt down on the floor and drew this outline of my body. And then once I'd done that, she got me to lie down on that exact same piece of paper, and she traced around the outside of me. And after kind of looking back down at the paper, it was at that point that I realized that actually the way that I viewed myself was so distorted, and that maybe there was something the matter with me. And I remember on that Friday night being quite overwhelmed by the kind of imagery on the floor, and was kind of thinking to myself, do you know what, I'm just going to give this a go. I'm just going to start eating. I'm going to just see what happens. And then at least I could get out and do exactly what I want to do. But actually over that kind of year-long stay in hospital, I gradually began to really accept that I needed that support, gradually began to open up, and just gradually began to realize there was so much more to my life than the eating disorder.
What first inspired your Dump the Scales and Curb the Count campaigns, and what has the result been?
So I started campaigning about 4 and a bit years ago. And the more I kind of started sharing my experience and what I'd been through, the more I was coming into contact with people who'd been through such similar things on their journeys. When we think of eating disorders, we often think of a white teenage girl who's extremely underweight. And it means that actually a lot of the time people who are struggling, if they don't fit neatly into that category, firstly, they can't get support on the NHS because it only facilitates for those who are underweight. But also, secondly, it often stops people reaching out for support. This happened to me back in 2016. I tried to get treatment and wasn't able to because I wasn't underweight. And I remember leaving that appointment and just being so upset by the whole thing. I felt like I'd faced this massive injustice. I felt like I really deserved this treatment. But on top of that, the eating disorder part of my brain, which is extremely competitive, like immediately kicked in and started telling me that no one believed me, that everyone thought I was attention seeking, that I had to make a point, that I had to prove myself to others that I wasn't quite good enough unless I lost a little bit more weight. And after kind of talking about this so much more with people, I realized that actually it's something that so many people are currently facing on a day-to-day basis. People are unable to get treatment and support. So I launched the Dump the Scales, the campaign, off the back of that, and it's gone really well, actually. So when I kind of launched it, I didn't really think anything was going to happen. I thought it was going to be a bit of a disaster. But over kind of the next kind of couple of weeks after launching it, it managed to get a lot of signatures on it, and has now hit over 100,000. I've had the petition debated in Parliament a number of times, taken it to Downing Street, and had a lot of kind of ministerial meetings actually looking at what this means. The campaign's now gone on to like a little bit of a next phase. So now we're looking wider than just focusing on kind of trying to get rid of BMI when it comes to diagnosing someone with an eating disorder, but looking a lot more at kind of what funding we've got in place. We're looking at the workforce. We're looking at making sure the right education is put forward. And I think particularly at the moment, given the year that we've had and given the increase in people struggling with eating disorders, and particularly within the adult population, we're now seeing that over 16 years old, 16% of people will at some point have an eating disorder. So that's in a room of 100 people, that's 16 people are likely to go on and develop an eating disorder. And given that kind of increased numbers and the surge in people struggling and the lack of services, a lot of the focus at the moment is around trying to get some kind of emergency funding put into treatment, and then to look at actually how we can have a complete reformation of all eating disorder services and treatment so that people can go on to make that full recovery and have that right support throughout that whole process.
Fantastic. It's such incredible work that you've done. So the Curb the Count campaign, what was that one about?
So Curb the Count was all around trying to stop the calories being put on menus.
Right.
So about a year and a half ago, the government announced they were looking into doing this. And statistically, we know that 25% of people who start calorie counting will go on to develop an eating disorder. 35% will spend the rest of their life with some unhealthy relationship with food. We also know that calories aren't a real way of measuring something, and they're so inaccurate. But I think on top of that, if you've had an eating disorder and the calories are there, you're going to be even kind of into this bigger mental torment kind of battle going on in your head when you go to restaurants. So I launched that campaign as a trying to kind of put a hold on that legislation. The successful part of it was actually, since launching it, I've now had a number of meetings with Public Health England, actually looking at what we can be doing instead and how we can really be challenging that. Unfortunately, the legislation is looking like it will go ahead and come out next April. But at the moment, I'm kind of working quite closely with Department of Health, looking at actually how we can really manage this fallout, that we're kind of the inevitable fallout that we're going to get from putting the calories on the menu, and making sure, I think as well, that there's a lot more education being done so that people really understand, like, not just the dangers around it, but actually how inaccurate a measurement this is.
What can businesses do to support the health and well-being of their staff?
So the first thing is around normalizing conversations. So having that normalization right from the top, so people who are kind of a bit more junior feel like they can also talk about their own mental health and their own well-being. I think generally across organizations, we need to look at what communications we're sending out. So making sure that actually, again, we're opening up that line of conversation, but we're giving practical kind of top tips on actually how to manage our well-being. I think within that as well is looking at actually what our KPI focus is. So making sure that maybe once a week, we have a space in our team meetings, in our one-to-ones, to really check in on what someone's mental health is, to check in on someone's well-being, instead of getting so fixated on trying to achieve so much XYZ by the kind of like a specific end date. And then I think more broadly, kind of really practically, particularly when we're looking at things like eating disorders, it's about avoiding diet chat. So making sure that we're not kind of constantly flooding ourselves with that conversation, because for all we know, we might be sitting next to someone who's really struggling with an unhealthy relationship with food. It's also about making sure that if you have team events or team activities or team lunches, making sure that they don't always happen around food, but if they do, maybe providing a menu or some options of restaurants. And the person who maybe has struggled with an eating disorder can then have a little bit more of a choice of actually where to go. And I think finally, like when you do have things like cake in the office, which I'm sure at some point will come back, it's actually not pushing people to have a slice of cake if they don't want one, like just accepting that they might not want it. I know from my experience of working kind of in offices, like the amount of times that I'd have to think of endless excuses for why I didn't want to have a piece of cake. And it was just so frustrating. And then even when people found out that I had an eating disorder, they then had this look of shock whenever I did have a slice of cake. And it's like, actually, do you know what? Like my eating disorder was never about that slice of cake. It was about so much more than that. But actually, just by giving people that space where they don't constantly feel like they are being judged left, right, and center for what they're eating, and the fear of people commenting on their foods, I think will help just create a much safer environment.
How can business leaders bust the stigma surrounding mental health in the workplace?
It's all about talking about it. It's about making sure that we talk openly, we show that empathy, we create a safe space so that people can come to work and say, do you know what, I'm having a rubbish day today. I don't feel great today. And for when individuals do that, not taking work off them. One of the biggest fears that I often hear in workplaces is that particularly kind of more junior people are anxious that if they come into work and they're having a difficult day and they say something, that actually all of their projects will be taken off and they won't be able to go for promotion, anything like that. So it's about creating a system that really, really works for that person to get the support they need, when at the same time offering that reassurance where necessary. And I think as well, like really understanding actually the impact of the pandemic on people. We know that this year has been really, really challenging on so many people. There's been things that we've loved, things that we've all hated. But I think, again, creating that space so people can be really honest about it it helps someone to just kind of feel like, actually, do you know what? Like, I need to take a bit of a slower morning today. I need to take a little bit of a step back. And then I think the other thing that really helps with kind of busting stigma is also educating our staff. It's about educating them on actually how to spot the signs in people around them, educating them on how to have a conversation around it, and helping them to realize that actually people can function at a very high level with a mental health issue. And that's normally what seems to be happening at the moment. And that is okay. But again, create that space where actually they're functioning, but able to get that additional support when necessary.